Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, grabbing your phone, and seeing the news that the single organization that has shaped Western security for decades simply vanished overnight. Not gradually, not through some long, drawn-out political negotiation, just gone in one sudden, inexplicable moment. The alliance that anchored military strategy and completely shaped global politics for generations has literally evaporated.
Who protects us now? That is the terrifying existential question staring dozens of nations right in the face the second they realize their ultimate security shield is just gone. You see, for generations, leaders and citizens have basically just assumed this invisible framework would always be there. If it evaporated without warning, the balance of power across Europe, North America, and really the whole world would shift so violently that governments would honestly struggle to even comprehend the immediate shock.
So let's be totally clear about what this means on the ground. We're not just talking about a piece of paper disappearing. We are talking about the complete evaporation of the entire architecture of modern defense. Suddenly, there's no joint command structure. There is no Article 5 guaranteeing that an attack on one is an attack on all. There's zero collective defense mechanism and absolutely no coordinated shield standing between dozens of nations and the threats they've spent decades preparing to face together. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this, let's look at Section 1. The day NATO vanished, and explore that immediate day zero fallout. The escalation here would be terrifyingly fast. In the first few minutes, you're just dealing with utter confusion. Leaders are rushing into emergency meetings, frantically trying to figure out if this is a legal collapse, a massive cyber event, or some sort of coordinated global sabotage. Within a few hours, that confusion morphs into absolute panic. And by the first few days, governments are forced into making agonizingly hard decisions simply because the old rules of global security don't apply anymore. Because here's the thing, for smaller nations, especially those border states right near Russia, NATO isn't just about troop numbers or hardware. It is fundamentally a promise that they won't stand alone against intimidation from larger powers. Within minutes of this collapse, that promise is gone. Countries that relied heavily on that strategic reassurance are thrown into this terrifying uncertainty, instantly having to ask themselves if their own isolated armies, air defenses, and intelligence networks are actually enough to survive. Which brings us right into Section 2, the security vacuum. This sudden absence triggers a frantic scramble for both Europe and the United States. Think of the old reality like a massive interconnected power grid. It was built entirely on networked strength. Shared costs, rapid reinforcement, systems all seamlessly talking to one another. The new reality? Isolated vulnerability. Without that grid, every single military node is disconnected, uncoordinated, and massively expensive to maintain on its own. Modern defense completely relies on that networked strength, and without it, even the most powerful militaries on Earth are suddenly incredibly exposed. Over in Europe, this places an impossible burden on governments literally overnight. Nations that had comfortably pushed defense spending to the back burner are suddenly scrambling. You'd see intense, immediate debates erupting over reinstating conscription, rapidly buying up weapons, and totally overhauling air defenses. Plus, there'd be this immense pressure on the European Union to magically transform into a hard power security bloc, a task that requires a shared history of planning that you just can't generate with a few rush signatures. Meanwhile, the United States gets hit with its own massive strategic shock. The political debate in Washington would ignite instantly. On one side, you'd hear intense arguments that America should use this exact moment to step back from global commitments and just focus entirely on domestic priorities. But on the other side, the warnings would be deafening, arguing that abandoning collective defense will create a world deeply hostile to American interests. It forces a complete, ground-up reassessment of bases, troop deployments, and the whole concept of shared global obligations. And you know, this domestic panic quickly bleeds into a global crisis. For smaller nations in places like the Baltics, Eastern Europe, or Scandinavia, this triggers a terrifying domino effect. Fear enters the chat. Because they no longer trust the old safety net, they start seeking out these rushed bilateral pacts and rapidly pumping up their defense spending, which inevitably triggers a continent-wide self-reinforcing arms race. And the crazy part? They aren't doing this because they want war, but purely out of a sheer instinct to survive. But hey, this isn't just a military crisis. It's an instantaneous financial one. Let's move to Section 3, the economic shockwave. If there is one thing global markets absolutely despise, it's uncertainty. And the disappearance of NATO is pretty much the ultimate uncertainty. Capital would shift violently. Beneficiaries like defense stocks, surveillance tech, and private security companies would surge as governments start writing blank checks for weapons. But on the flip side, confidence in broader markets would absolutely tank. International shipping, cross-border supply chains, and basically all civilian sectors would suffer massively because long-term planning becomes virtually impossible in a destabilized world. And here is where it really hits close to home: the actual price of confidence. Duplication is ridiculously expensive. Every single country trying to build its own isolated defense system ends up spending drastically more than a coordinated alliance would. To fund all this, public debt skyrockets. Governments are forced to yank massive amounts of funding away from the things you actually rely on, like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, just to cover the ballooning costs of uncoordinated security. And we can't forget that these vulnerabilities aren't just physical. That leads us to Section 4, digital and global fallout. Because a world without NATO isn't just a world with fewer tanks on the border. It's a world where digital trust is completely shattered. See, NATO actually serves as this massive platform for cyber defense cooperation. Without it, critical infrastructure, government systems, and major financial institutions are suddenly wide open to both state and non-state hackers. A cyber attack on an isolated, vulnerable system could paralyze entire cities or trigger automated responses that rapidly spiral completely out of control. And here is the ugly truth about power vacuums: they do not stay empty for long. Rival powers, who are no longer deterred by a huge unified alliance, would inevitably be tempted to test the waters. We'd absolutely see a reassessment of red lines, increased pressure along borders, super aggressive cyber operations, and highly provocative military exercises. Even if no one actually wants to start a full-blown war, the temptation to test this new, shaky balance of power would be overwhelming. So how do we even begin to move forward from that? That brings us to Section 5, rebuilding a fractured world. Almost certainly, nations are going to try to form new alliances. But here's the catch: alliances require doctrine, absolute trust, integrated command systems, and time. You can't just build them on emergency summit speeches. This drops us right into the most dangerous window of all: the gap between collapse and reconstruction. During this interim period, every government is operating in a fog of profound uncertainty, and it's exactly in that kind of uncertainty where catastrophic miscalculations happen. Internally, societies would be torn apart by a fierce ideological battle. One side is going to loudly argue that the collapse proves old alliances are obsolete anyway, and that true sovereign nations need to rely entirely on themselves. The other side? They'll argue the exact opposite, that modern threats are just way too complex for isolation, making new alliances more necessary than ever before. This debate would completely dominate elections, news cycles, and fundamentally shape the defense policies of this whole new era. And we really cannot ignore the public here. The mood shifts in pretty distinct waves. You've got pure disbelief and anger in those first few days. Then fear and intense political debate in the weeks that follow. But as the months set in, it morphs into this deep, existential concern. Families start questioning their basic safety. Young people might seriously wonder about military service or preparing for civil unrest. Once the public fundamentally stops trusting the systems to keep them safe, society itself becomes incredibly fragile. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Is there a chance this severe crisis could actually act as a catalyst for maturity? If leaders act wisely under all this immense pressure, the collapse of an old, comfortable system could force nations to step up and become more responsible. We might actually see serious, localized, long-term defense investments, way faster military modernization, a sharp drop in bureaucratic red tape, and highly adaptive regional solidarity. It could, painfully, forge a completely different, more self-reliant kind of stability. But of course, that requires wisdom in a time of sheer panic. Ultimately, the disappearance of NATO reveals a pretty sobering truth about our modern world. Peace is often held together by institutions people barely even notice until they're gone. It's this invisible, highly coordinated architecture of global stability that we just take for granted as we go about our everyday lives.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question to consider as you look around the world today. What other hidden structures are currently keeping us from tipping into chaos?